Lucky each week to be joined by Leith Van Onselen, Chief Economist at the MB Fund at MB Super. He's one of the merry bunch of men who make macrobusiness.com.au a thing, and we love looking at that each day, the best finance reporting in the world. And Leith Van Onselen joins me on the line. How are you, my friend?
Good, thanks, Luke. How about yourself?
I'm extra well, thank you. We've got a rainy Saturday in Sydney. What's it like in Melbourne, assuming you're at home?
It's actually pretty sunny, mate. It's quite good. We got a bit of rain last night, but yeah, it's nice today.
Okay, yay. Australia's gas idiocy. I think that's a right way of putting it here. Now, we had the government come out and signal that they'd almost, rediscovered the importance of gas in the energy mix. And you and I have spoken for ages about how we don't pay what we should pay because at the end of the day, it's our gas. But we have just so mismanaged this, haven't we?
Oh, mate, absolutely. Look, the gas is like, Australia's like the Saudi Arabia of gas, right? We are swimming in the stuff. We have oodles of gas. We're one of the world's biggest exporters of gas, yet somehow we've created a domestic shortage at home and we pay ridiculously high prices on the East Coast. Now, Australia's East Coast exports about 80% of its gas overseas. Most of it goes to China. About 70% of it goes to China. But for some crazy reason, despite the fact that we export 4/5 of it, we've now got domestic gas shortages. And we've also, paying these ridiculously high prices on the East Coast, which means that if you're a household, you pay more to use gas in your cooking. If you're a Victorian, where, most people heat their homes with gas because our winters here are very cold, you end up paying, ridiculous amounts for your gas. But more importantly, it means that our manufacturers cannot stay competitive. Now, just this week, several manufacturing firms, Orica, which is an explosives manufacturer, Mars, Nestle, PepsiCo, they all warned that high gas prices on the east coast of Australia, which are among the highest in the world, and they said that they're averaging about $12 a gigajoule on the east coast of Australia versus $4 in the US, in Australian dollars, $4 per gigajoule, has made manufacturing in Australia unaffordable, and it's going to result in lots of manufacturing closures. Now, this comes at a time when the Albanese government is preaching their future-made manufacturing initiative, where they're saying, Australia's got to get its manufacturing share up. We've currently got the lowest manufacturing share in the OECD out of any significant country. I think Liechtenstein might be below us.
Uh-huh.
But, like about 5% of our economy is now manufacturing, and the manufacturers that are remaining are saying that our energy prices are too high and they can't compete and they're going to close down. And yet the government's telling us that we need to get our manufacturing up. And instead of just simply copying what they do in Western Australia, Western Australia's basically set a goal where they say 15% of all export gas has to be for domestic use, and they've capped the price at a maximum of $6 a gigajoule. And what it's meant is that Western Australia has abundant gas for its domestic use, doesn't have shortages, and it pays some of the lowest gas and electricity prices in the world. Now, electricity is really important here because gas sets the electricity price, because gas is what they call the firming fuel.
Yeah.
So what it means is when you don't have enough renewables, or you need backup from your coal because you have a spike in electricity demand, they use gas because gas can be turned on and off at a whim. And if you have a really high gas price, it then pushes up your electricity prices. So this energy idiocy that we've got, where we've somehow manufactured a shortage of gas on the East Coast by allowing effectively a handful of companies which are foreign owned to exploit our gas, flog it off all offshore and gouge us domestically, has led to this bizarre situation where we're uncompetitive, we're all paying high prices, and now there's warnings that we're going to not have enough gas. So guess what the solution is, Luke?
Tell me.
Instead of simply copying Western Australia and every other gas exporting country on the planet and reserving gas for domestic use, so saying we've got to have 15 to 20% of gas has got to be for domestic use first, and keeping it and pegging the price to a low level like they do everywhere else. The big brainiac solution now is to build import terminals along the East Coast. So they want to build 3 import terminals. Now, just to give listeners an example of how ridiculous this is, can you imagine Saudi Arabia, which is the world's biggest oil producer, or any of those Middle Eastern countries, which are swimming in oil, they export it all across the world. Can you imagine their residents paying $2 a litre for their petrol and then having to build an import terminal because they've magically created a shortage of oil at home, so they have to import oil from overseas? This is effectively what these morons want to do. And what all it's going to do is they're going to cost billions of dollars to build these terminals. We're going to effectively be, burning about 6% of our gas to turn into liquid to put on a ship, to then buy that gas back at an import terminal at high global prices, to then degasify it, to then power our industry. It's just moronic. Instead of just saying, how about we domestically reserve our gas so we don't have to do any of that stuff? And, this is the idiots that run our country at the moment. They create the problem. They let a cartel of foreign-owned companies take our resources, flog them overseas. We don't tax it properly. They gouge us with prices. And this is the result. You get this sort of policy, a Band-Aid on top of a Band-Aid on top of a Band-Aid, which doesn't fix the underlying problem. And if they keep doing this sort of stuff, we're just going to lock in high gas prices forever on the East Coast. We're going to have more manufacturers close. We're going to have higher cost of living because it's going to feed into electricity prices and, gas prices for heating, etc. It is just idiocy. And this is the sort of policy that we've got in Australia right now.
Yeah. So during the comparison we had when the lockdown was on, the cheapest or near enough to the cheapest power was on the West Coast, did you say, where there's reservation?
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
the government said, listen, go knock yourself out. If you want to extract gas and sell it around the world, go your hardest. But see those mugs over there living in the mainland, WA main, they get 15% of everything or 10% of everything that you extract, and they get it cheap, right? That's a deal, right? Because it's their gas, right? I mean, that just makes perfect sense. But where I struggle, and I agree with everything that you've said there, and it is such a good point to make, but how do we retrospectively reserve gas? If we had new people extracting gas, if we didn't have stupid government saying, no gas, then, you could do it as a condition of a new venture. But how do we get our gas back, mate?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for starters, we shouldn't have a ban on exploration for starters. So where I live in Victoria, which is a moron state, the former Premier, Daniel Andrews, and the current government basically said they banned future gas projects, right? So they said we can't have any more gas, even though we do have onshore gas. And this is coming at the same time as the Bass Strait gas reserves, which is where we get most of the gas at the moment, is running out. But we do have gas here, conventional gas that we could exploit, but the government said we're not allowed to, right? So that's part of the problem. But at the same time, we're actually exporting so much gas to China and Japan that they have too much of it, of our gas, and they're actually re-exporting it. Yep. So we're selling them the gas. They don't need all of that gas that they're selling, so then they're re-exporting it on.
Yep.
And my view is we should just cut it from China, to be quite frank, because China has treated us poorly in a whole bunch of areas. 70% of it goes to China. They're not exactly a great trading partner in my view. They've rogered us on a whole bunch of areas.
They attack our Navy, Air Force, and Army. They only last week they had a crack at one of our servicemen or women. I mean, let's rewrite But you know what? When we stand up to China, and not everyone liked him. I understand that. But when Morrison said, "Hey, this COVID-19 thing, we need a proper look," and then they said, "Oh no," and they sent the international group there to investigate, and of course all the evidence went missing and they weren't given access. You stand up to China and then, okay, we're not going to buy your lobsters, and now this week it'll be barley and that. But at some point, don't we have to stand for something? And
absolutely.
Aren't we at that point now? Isn't having a crack at our divers or helicopter pilots enough to say, you know what, love you like a brother? Not really, but there's a new game in town, and we're going to give the advantage, or we're going to do the right thing by the people who live here first, and then maybe we'll have a chat to you later down the track. What's wrong with that thinking? People say it's populism. Screw that. It's looking after the people who work here, pay taxes here, employ people here, blah, blah, blah. I mean, goodness me.
Yeah, and to be fair, they'd probably respect us more if we actually stood up for ourselves. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. Like the Chinese are allowed to, cancel a whole bunch of contracts with wine and everything else. But, why don't we hit them back and say, well, hang on, we're going to keep a little bit more of our gas now. And the gas cartel can find more gas reserves. Like, they actually, look, they are sitting on a lot of reserves. They could meet the gap if they wanted to, but there's no incentive for them to do so at the moment, because they can export overseas and then they can basically charge higher prices at home, and they make profits on both ends.
Yeah.
So we've just basically handed the whole thing off to a cartel. We don't tax them properly. if I had my way, we'd be just copying Norway and basically taxing the buggery out of gas. Like Norway taxes their gas and oil industry at about 80%, effectively, and part of that's because a lot of their gas and oil companies are actually publicly owned, so they get all the profits from it. But the ones that are privately owned pay massive taxes, and as a result, Norwegians are sitting on a sovereign wealth fund, which they've used out of that gas and oil money, worth $250,000 per resident US. And here we are. We don't do any of that stuff. We've engineered a shortage of gas, which has pushed up our electricity prices. We're paying high prices, and then we're wondering why we've got no tax revenue. And, we end up having to just rely on personal income taxes and all this other stuff. It's just crazy. Everything we do in this country is just back to front.
Yeah. Now let's go to the rental crisis, which we've covered extensively from week to week. But there will be those people who think the biggest friends of those who rent are the Greens because they've, played a few pranks and talked about it a bit. But that's not right, is it?
No, so there's a mob called Better Renting. I'm not actually sure they are. They're one of these sort of, I think they're one of these renting, advocate organisations, and they've done an analysis of domain rental data, and they put out some research this week that said that if Australia had frozen rents a year ago, tenants in Australia would be $3.8 billion better off, right? And if we'd frozen rents 2 years ago, they'd be $6.7 billion better off. Well, yeah, of course they would. And anyway, of course, Greens housing spokesman Max Chandler-Mather, who I've talked about before, jumped on the analysis and he said, this is proof that we need to freeze rents and blah, 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 because tenants, it'd help tenants out. It's like, well, yeah, of course it would. But, sure, tenants would benefit from a rental freeze. Of course they would. But the same could be said for any cost of living measure. So surely homeowners would benefit if we had a mortgage freeze, Luke, don't you think?
I reckon.
Yeah, or households probably would benefit if we froze gas prices and electricity bills, or maybe if we froze petrol prices at 1990 levels, we'd be better off as well. Or, you know what? Beer drinkers would have benefited if alcohol excise was abolished. I mean, where's this going to end?
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the actual driver of Australia's, rental crisis, mass immigration, which is basically what's caused this problem in the last few years, continues unabated. And Max Chandler-Mather is a massive supporter of that. He's said on the record multiple times that he thinks more immigration is a good thing. So, I just find these clowns unbelievable. They pick one little stat, say we should have frozen rents 12 months ago.
Yeah.
Well, I'm a consumer. I would have loved to have seen a whole bunch of prices frozen 12 months ago. I would have been better off if that's the case. But that's not how it works.
Yeah.
That's not how a market works.
Yeah.
And if they're worried about rents, they should simply lower immigration. It's pretty obvious.
Pretty obvious. And tell me quickly before you go, the RBA Governor, Michelle Bullock, she's been running interference on immigration and population, hasn't she?
Oh, mate, where do you start with this stuff? So on Tuesday, the Reserve Bank of Australia left the cash rate on hold. Everyone probably knows that. But in the question and answer for the Governor, Michelle Bullock, someone asked her what the impact of immigration was on inflation, and she said that, yes, strong immigration is definitely driving up housing inflation, most notably in the rental market. We all know that. But that this has been offset by immigration dampening wage growth. That was her saying. So she said the overall impact on inflation isn't as high as everyone thinks because, yes, while it's pushing up your house costs, guess what? It's lowering your wages, and that's dampening inflation. Well, my response to the Governor is, doesn't that mean that immigration in its current form is an absolute disaster for working Australians because it's lowering their wages while driving up their cost of living? So, anyone trying to buy a home in Australia or trying to rent knows that this immigration is massively inflationary. And the Reserve Bank's got basically two KPIs, Luke. It's got full employment and low inflation. And my argument is that extreme levels of immigration work against both of those. Yeah. So it works against full employment because obviously you're flooding the place with extra workers.
Yeah.
And that pushes up the unemployment rate, other things equal. And it also pushes up rents, which is inflationary. So anyway, it's just another thing where the RBA tacitly admitted without knowing that she was doing it, that it's actually disastrous for the working class.
And mate, one without notice, what's your position on interest rates now? Do you imagine there'll be a tick up at some point before the end of the year or not?
No, I don't think they will. I think they're going to be on hold for a while and then they're still going to come down. I still think the next move is going to be down either late this year or early next. The reason for that, Luke, is the employment market is way worse than what the official data says. Data this week from SEEK showed that there's about 60% more applicants per job ad currently, and that measure's traditionally tracked with the unemployment rate. So that sort of tells you unemployment's going to rocket. At the same time, household spending with all the latest retail sales that have come out has collapsed. So I think the consumer spending's really weak. That's 60% of the economy, and the unemployment rate's going to tick up fairly aggressively in the next, quarter or two. So I think that'll, keep rates on hold for a while, and then eventually they'll come down.
All right, mate. I can't tell you, as we've been talking, how many listeners have said this bloke should be PM. I don't know that you'd accept the pay cut, but anyway, a lot of people like your work.
Oh, cheers, Luke, and thanks everyone for listening.
Good on you. That's Leith Van Onselen, macrobusiness.com.au. We received an update in relation to the boat on fire